Hello and welcome to this video on the possibility of vampires being infected by viruses. The general nature of vampirism is a disease or state that is transmitted by blood from a vampire to a new host or victim.
As you may know, vampirism is an arbovirus carried in the saliva of predators. In 72 hours it spreads through the human bloodstream, creating new parasitic organs like cancer.
This alters the genome and cellular function so as to stop aging, allow for fast regeneration, and create a craving for blood. Changes to the brain and digestive tract cause them to hunger for the blood of uninfected humans. They are also known for their enhanced physical abilities, longevity, and adverse reaction to bright light and UV rays. In order for these changes to occur, the most likely explanation is a virus of some sort. Much like retroviruses, this would have the ability to insert a gene or multiple genes along with the viral genome. If, like other viruses, it spreads through bodily fluids, the need to bite the new host makes sense. The problem would be the virus genome size, and that is extremely large if we consider all the changes that happen. If we accept this as possible and plausible, and for now we ignore the impossible supernatural powers such as flight, transformation, and so on, we can figure out if a vampire could be infected by another virus. The nature of the changes in the human genome once infected by the vampire virus would include the following in the rapid 24 to 72 hour conversion. A change to the telomere genes. This would ensure they do not shorten. This will keep all cells alive for far longer than normally occurs. This is a consequence of significantly increased production of telomerase. This is a DNA sequence that, when present in conjunction with things like antioxidant enzymes and other protective measures, it ensures that DNA sequences remain intact, the DNA and cell are not turned over frequently, and gives the cell a natural longevity. This would also help in reducing the amount of protein clumping, a phenomenon we see with Alzheimer's disease where it causes neurodegeneration and ultimately death. Preventing this will allow the body to continue functioning long after its natural lifespan should have expired, both at a cellular level and at a whole organism level. The cells themselves would need to be able to accommodate all of the necessities for sustaining life long after the normal time for cellular turnover, but would also need to be able to produce far more virions than normal. Vampires would need to have a high resistance to tumours as a result, at least those that are malignant anyway. This would help in slowing down the aging process. Aging is one of the leading factors due to the number of mutations acquired, and older cells tend to be more likely to become cancerous. The best way this would be achieved is through preventing overcrowding, and that would be done through contact inhibition. Fundamentally, when cells get to a high enough density, they start dying. This would prevent most of the tumours from forming. The virus itself would also need to be mindful that when it becomes inserted into the cell genome, it goes into dormancy, and does not prevent a ridiculously high turnover in cells in an effort to create more viral particles, but would also need to ensure that there is some degree of it being produced. This would allow viruses to be shed into the saliva and other bodily fluids. It may also require the development of certain innate tissues specifically dedicated to that purpose. While we're talking about gross anatomical changes, such as special secretory tissues, we need to look at changes to the brain. Among the changes that would occur is a craving for blood and those extra sharp and acute senses that vampires are known for. It's thought that vampires are at least of a higher processing capacity than humans. They can think faster, respond faster, and identify things faster. It's possible that certain changes, such as in the amygdala of the brain, would be the cause of this. That, along with more efficient movement of neuronal signals, the brain could perform better, increasing its functionality. The changes in the brain are not the only ones that would occur. And while we mentioned earlier the possibility of developing special secretory tissues, it's possible that the virus could infect the bone marrow instead, and this would alter the production of new erythrocytes. Erythrocytes are the red blood cells, and they normally have a 180-day life cycle. Given the vampire's lifestyle and various other factors, the production of new erythrocytes would have to be diminished, but it would also have to retain them for longer as a result. When we combine this with everything else, it's possible that the bone marrow could be grossly altered to both produce slightly different red blood cells and also to produce the various required virion-producing cells. As a consequence of the vampire itself, and various changes we'll describe shortly, their bones will need to be harder and thicker than those of a normal human, and that these will need to get progressively thicker and harder over time. The vampire would need to have alterations to the GI tract and metabolism. This would be necessary to allow blood to provide sustenance. Blood by itself is primarily composed of water, red blood cells, and a few other factors, but it is these two primarily that make up the bulk of what is in blood. Water will have relatively little benefit to the vampire. The vampire would need to find a way to take the energy out of the human red blood cells and then make it usable to the vampire in some way or other. This will be important when we look at the way the vampire's metabolism works. By their very nature, they are supposed to be dead. This means they have a drastically reduced metabolism. Metabolism is the primary driver of body heat. Because there's very little metabolism and very little body heat, they don't have a high demand for oxygen. This means they might get away with a lot less red blood cells. What then happens to everything that they consume, whether that is what they've been drinking or what is produced as metabolic waste in the body? The vampire's body needs a way to dispose of waste, especially from drinking blood and what limited metabolism there is. As a general rule, it's likely they're going to have a buildup of bilirubin. This is a product of breaking down red blood cells, something that would have to happen given their diet. This then leads to a condition known as jaundice. Jaundice, as a rule, is a sign that the body is not able to dispose of the bilirubin as a waste product. This would lead to them becoming a slightly orangey yellow color over time. Due to the lack of oxygen, especially on the surface of their skin, it would gradually build up there, and then as it's removed from the body, they'd become a more pale, almost deathly color. Another byproduct of their metabolism and diet is the production of ammonia. Ammonia is a byproduct of the fact they would not be urinating as frequently. This would then build up in their bloodstream. After building up in their bloodstream, it travels to the skin where it enters sweat glands and is then removed from the body that way. The body would also need to be able to cope with the fact that the diet is primarily liquid. There's very little mass to it, and they would need to remove this primarily as a fluid, but with larger things like proteins being taken out through defecation. The body's structure and ultimately the overall physique would become more dense over time, removing more and more fluid through urination, but having relatively little fluid intake outside of that means that the body would have to become more and more dry. One of the byproducts of this dryness is things like muscle fibers would begin to compact, but the vampire itself, given its high acuity and physical strength, would have to have a lot more fast-twitch fibers as well. This means they become condensed. You can think of this as a difference between a human and an ape. Apes have far more dense muscle tissue than humans do. This is one reason why they struggle to swim. They would also need to have a much higher concentration of myoglobin and mitochondria within these muscle cells. This will allow them to act longer and as a stronger system. The result of this more pronounced muscle mass within a smaller space is ligaments and tendons become thicker. This is then going to act on those larger, thicker bones over time, causing them to thicken in response to the workload imposed on them. This means the vampire's body overall is relatively dry, but it has a lot of other changes that have happened. It is the nature and extent of these changes that would explain why few survive the process of being converted into a vampire. It also explains why viruses may struggle in this situation. If the vampire virus itself binds to a receptor, then it is possible that the host might be immune to some of the more common viruses. Consider this: some of the better known human pathogenic viruses like to hijack the receptors and signals the cells use. They then put out a false signal telling the immune system there's nothing to see here, move on. This means that the vampire virus might do one of two things. Either it might compromise the body's immune system and prevent it from identifying pathogens, or it could possibly aggravate the immune system. This would generate a stronger immune system response than the host previously had. It could also create a secretion that is competitive with other viruses. This means that it blocks the entry pathways for other viruses while allowing the vampire virus itself access to those cells. To a certain degree, given the nature of the vampire's metabolism, they have a lot of difficulty with controlling their homeostatic state. Mostly it is temperature we're worried about here, but that means that they can't induce a fever, or at least not effectively induce a fever. When we combine this with the fact that that is the human body's primary initial defense mechanism, it creates problems. It's possible that the vampire is secreting other chemicals within their body that act as a sort of antibiotic, or at least a natural antiviral agent. This means they may not need to have the same active immune system. While we're looking at the possible changes that the vampire virus could have caused, it's possible that they have altered the surface proteins. This would make many normal cells that the virus would target in a human incompatible with the vampiric version. Consider that many of them work on a lock and key model. If you have the wrong lock and you try to put the wrong key into it, you're not going to get a proper fix, and as a result, the virus can't pass through. If the vampiric cells are that drastically altered, it is entirely possible that they simply won't be compatible with most viruses that are out there in nature. Then we need to consider the possibility that one of the reasons why vampires are considered infertile is that they have had drastic and gross anatomical changes made, especially to the sexual reproductive system. It's possible similar changes have occurred throughout other parts of the body. If we've seen the changes in those regions, we may see similar changes in others. For example, at the moment, the current virus infects ACE2 receptors. This means it can commonly infect the testes, lungs, and heart. But if you find that the ACE2 receptor is missing from the testes, for one reason, it's possible that similar changes have occurred elsewhere. If not removing it entirely, then possibly downplaying its expression, leading to a significantly reduced incidence and liability to be infected. It's also likely that the vampires have a very different kind of biochemical structure in their body for signaling. Primarily, we're talking here about hormones. If the receptors and systems in place for hormones to function are not the same in a vampire, many of the normal viral mechanisms to encourage cellular proliferation may not work effectively. Consider that something like a tumor requires endothelial growth factor and vascularization signals to get blood flow, oxygen, and then nutrition. If they don't have those happening, then it's possible that even if a virus could get into the vampire and could begin infecting it, it would be unable to sustain that foothold. It would be unable to get the necessary material, especially talking about a very controlled environment with relatively little nucleic material. A new virus may struggle to get enough of that to create enough new copies of the virus to be able to keep going for very long. Meanwhile, the vampire virus may have a means of either synthesizing or working around these problems. This means that the changes in the vampire's body could possibly be very antagonistic and very detrimental to any other virus. The process of becoming a vampire makes the vampire host a very inhospitable place for other viruses. Between the drastically modified cells, toxic metabolites, and more, a virus that could infect a vampire needs to be far more adaptable than most viruses that currently exist. That means anything that did manage to infect a vampire is likely to have been synthetic in origin. By the same stroke of misfortune, the normal immunological responses of the human body do not necessarily work in the vampire's body for the same reasons. That same toxic environment prevents things like normal immunological cell function from being as effective, but it also delays any possible infection from getting a foothold for far longer. This becomes two sides of the same coin. In one hand, the vampire's body is extremely resistant to infection. On the other side, if it is infected by something, it might take a lot longer to recover. Ultimately, it's unlikely that a virus that is going to occur in the wild would be able to infect vampires, especially if we're talking about a human one in origin, something that was modified. This is simply because the vampire's body, physiology, and biochemistry is drastically different and so foreign to the human state. It's possible there is something in nature that would work, but it needs to be very, very unique. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions below.